I'm joined today by three great voices to talk to us about whether this is a moment or a movement, and also to let us know what will it take to move this thing forward so that the protests and the sort of internal view of our lives that we had over the last 6 months will continue into the future. Our panel today consists of Alicia Garza, who's the principal at Black Futures Lab, one of the founders of the Black Lives Matters movement, and a longtime activist and soon-to-be author. Next, it's Sunny Hostin, co-host of ABC Television's The View. She's a former prosecutor, a lawyer, and also an author. And finally, Mayor Marvin Rees, the mayor of Bristol, England. He's the first Black mayor of the city, and he's also been a large voice across Europe about the need to incorporate people of color into the mainstream. It's going to be great to hear from them, so let's get started. All of you, thank you for being here. I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to start with you, Alicia. One of the things that so many people have sort of linked to the protests that we've seen this year has been this sort of growing awareness about what Black Lives Matter started, and this discussion about equality and sort of equal treatment of people around the globe. When this started as an idea with the three of you and two of your colleagues, did you have any idea that we were going to see this turn into something that went far beyond sort of an interest of just Black people?
No, I don't think we had any idea, although, frankly, I think it's important that this movement has grown in such powerful ways. I always tell people that we didn't start this in a boardroom. There were no graphs and charts and strategic plans. It really was just an idea whose time had come. And we were really able to meet a moment, particularly around the acquittal of a man in the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. And we were able to talk about Black Lives Matter, not just in relationship to police violence or vigilante violence, but certainly to connect those types and forms of violence to the everyday experiences of Black communities around the world. I think from that point, other communities were able to also say, this is happening to us as well. And so I think what we're seeing here, much more so than in 2013 when we began, is a real deepening and connecting between and amongst communities around the ways in which disparities and inequality impact our lives. And then I think in that connection, what we're seeing is a joint vision for how it is that we want to see our communities grow and thrive. And so I think we're seeing that expressed both in a desire to divest from a punishment economy and invest into a caring economy that rebuilds the infrastructure that's been decimated in so many of our communities.
Now, Sunny, one of the things that's always surprised me is a lot of what we talk about now about inequality among people, racial inequality, class inequality, has been around for a long time. A lot of this has been sort of like, in plain sight. But when we saw the George Zimmerman case, that spawned Black Lives Matter movement, the media jumped in there in a way that in the past they hadn't really sort of talked about, the difference of treatment. And I also see that with George Floyd, I think the media has been a big part of why this has become a national and international issue. Do you think that there's been a difference in treatment in the way that media looks at, these issues of not just Black empowerment, but almost of any other empowerment?
I certainly think there has been a change, not a big enough change. In 2013, when Trayvon Martin was murdered, I think Ben Crump, his attorney, or the attorney for the Martin family, realized that these cases were covered as not national cases, but local cases. And he tapped into something that had never been done before. He started reaching out to people like me, people like Roland Martin, other reporters, to make it a national story, to plug into the fact that this was happening, as Alicia mentioned, all over the country, if not all over the world, that Black bodies were being brutalized by vigilantes, were being brutalized systemically by law enforcement. So you fast forward 7 years, and now media knows that this is going on a national basis, but Black bodies are still, in my view, portrayed not as victims necessarily, but portrayed more as perpetrators. They are still dehumanized in the way that I think Trayvon Martin was dehumanized. While it's getting better, we are not there yet because many of us are reporting, but we are not making editorial decisions. We are not behind the camera. We are not editors of newsrooms. We are not presidents in those newsrooms. And so while I think the coverage, again, is better and it's being covered, the Black and brown bodies aren't really being humanized in the way that they should be.
Mayor Rees, I want to sort of jump off something that Sunny said, which is that, this became here in the United States a national event very quickly. I've been struck by how many places around the world also sort of, jumped into the cause here. I know that in your own city, there was a very localized event that sort of captured people's imagination. It was the notion of how to deal with Edward Colston, whom I believe is an extremely well-known and well-respected philanthropist for the city, who had a past that maybe 100 years ago didn't matter, but now the fact that he had been involved in the slave trade suddenly made the city look at him in a different way. Is that something that would have happened as recently as 50 years ago?
No, but let me just say that the dehumanization of Black people and the criminalization of African heritage people is global, and that's why there was so much feeling of connection between people in Bristol and I would say across the whole of the UK and what was happening in the United States. Deaths in custody, people are being gunned down on the streets before they're even taken into custody, but we do have deaths in custody. Christopher Older, Sean Rigg are just two of the people that went into custody and died. I used to work on a program in the health service looking at our mental health institutions, and a number of Black people that died in mental health institutions after being restrained by mental health nurses. So we know this is a global phenomenon, but I think it is about, from my sense as well, and I hope I'm not putting my own meaning on it, this is about the actual physical violence that happens between baddie individuals and other individuals. But for me, more telling is a system that just fails to say that behavior is not okay and then to hold people that can. The real affirmation that Black lives don't matter comes when the system says, it's fine, we're not even going to prosecute you, or we're not going to arrest you. If there was a system that held people to account, I'd probably feel a little bit more relaxed because I'd feel that justice was going to be done, but it doesn't. And to me, that is the great systemic evil.
One of this whole notion of systemic racism and systemic sort of inequality is something that we're talking about a lot today in the conference. Alicia, why has it always been thought of? Well, I shouldn't say always, but it's often thought of when we talk about sort of police violence. When it's perpetrated on somebody who's in the majority, it's thought of that way as police violence. When it's not, it's often thought of as, we're dealing with criminals and therefore criminals can't be coddled or they can't be whatever. I mean, is that something that you think a lot of younger people are awakening, that that's been a blind spot in American history? Or is this going to be something that's going to be forgotten in 6 months?
This is a really important question. I mean, I think at the end of the day, I don't think that we question enough the role that police are playing in our communities. I think we have some hegemonic ideas, not just in this country, but across the world. The police essentially are untouchable. And whether they're enacting violence on white communities or Black communities, there's not a significant difference, I don't think, in how we cover this. Predominantly because I think it's such an anomaly when police violence happens in communities that are not of color. I think that at the same time, what's coming into question right now is really, it's as the mayor said, it's about the question of accountability. I think just as deeply as people feel that police are supposed to protect and serve the communities that they're located in, as deeply as people feel that police are supposed to keep you safe and that that is the role that they play in our communities, I think there is also a growing sense that the untouchability of law enforcement needs to be addressed. And this question of accountability and calling people to account when they commit crimes in our community is deeply, deeply unequal. I know that in the Black Census Project that we conducted at the Black Futures Lab, which is the largest survey of Black people in America in 155 years, almost everybody who took our survey said that what they want to see done about police violence is to see police be held accountable when they commit crimes in our communities. And so when you look at cases like the murder of George Floyd, the case of Breonna Taylor, time and time again, people are seeing outrageous behavior and outrageous activity, and yet there really aren't mechanisms that are being enforced that show the rest of the world and the rest of the country that nobody is above the law. And that is actually what is creating this kind of break in our country right now, where people are saying, hey, this is very clear that there is unequal treatment that's happening here. You're a police officer, but you should be held accountable if you are committing a crime in our community, just as our communities are hyper-policed and held accountable in ways that I think we don't see happen equally across the board. So that's what I think is happening here. And for the question of, is there something we can do about it? Absolutely. Number one, we can actually address the fact that police violence is real. So often, right, we are being gaslit into a conversation about whether something is violence or not, or who was the aggressor. And in each of these cases that we see, starting with the Trayvon Martin case, where literally media was reporting on this case as if Trayvon Martin himself was on trial, too often it's Black bodies who are seen as the criminal, as the aggressor, and as incapable of being redeemed. Whereas on the other side of the table, we rarely see, right, cases where officers and their backgrounds and their histories are being examined in the same kind of way, nor do we see the kind of rule and policy changes that could result in substantive shifts for our communities. So that is something that we can do right now, but it requires that we acknowledge that there's a problem in the first place.
I'd like
Sunny,
to
is there
weigh in.
Please go ahead.
As a former federal prosecutor, I'd like to weigh in on the accountability piece, because I think Mayor Rees and Alicia make very important points. There is a problem with accountability from a prosecutorial standpoint. And I think one of the reasons, there are two reasons for it. One is the stranglehold that police unions have on the system, thus making police officers and law enforcement in general untouchable when it comes to the system. They have almost no civil liability in many respects. And although sometimes you can't get criminal liability, if you bankrupt a police department because of this kind of bad behavior, to be sure, there will be police reform. We know historically certain civil rights organizations took to the courtroom in civil litigation and basically took certain chapters of the KKK out of business because they sued them civilly. That is something that almost cannot be done, at least in the United States, because of the stranglehold that police unions have on the system. The second part of it is, I think that there is such a dearth of Black prosecutors in the courtroom that it is very difficult for many prosecutors to see the humanity of Black victims, unfortunately. And I know this because I was a Black prosecutor in the courtroom. For some reason, people don't understand that the most powerful person in the criminal justice system is not the judge, is not the defense attorney, but it is the prosecutor, because that person makes the determination as to whether or not a case goes forward, whether or not a police officer will be held to account. And by and large, if that person does not see the humanity of the victim, that case does not go to trial. That case does not even go to a grand jury. And so I think if this problem is to be addressed, it has to be addressed in those two ways. It has to be addressed by making sure you have a prosecutor who is going to do the work appropriately, and you have to make sure on the civil side that police officers will be held to account and be held personally liable also for their behavior.
Now, Mayor Rees, we've been talking a lot about, the way police, and policing sort of affects, communities, particularly communities of color. I'm wondering, in this discussion that we're having globally now about, sort of where the lives of, sort of minority and majority populations intersect, and what sort of respect should be paid, to either side. I mean, are we at a point now where other sort of truths from people of color, people who are not in the majority, are suddenly going to be taken a lot more seriously, outside of policing, beyond policing, whether it's economic equality, whether it's other ways that politics can influence their lives? Is this a moment for that?
I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. I think the status quo was over the centuries has shown itself remarkably resilient and able to adapt and change and stay the same. So certainly we have a moment, but we've had moments before, didn't we? After World War I, it was supposed to be the war to end all wars. And then we had World War II. We got the post-war era, decolonization around the world, anti-globalization protests, debt protests, the financial crash 2008. We've had these epic global moments where we think this is it. The voice of justice, the voice of change is here, and we found slowly but surely we've slipped back into the same old hierarchy. It may have a different form of presentation. So that's a concern. I don't mean to be pessimistic and doom and gloom. We just have to be real about the strength of the status quo.
Now, Alicia, one of the things you're doing with your latest project is trying to find ways to make sure that voices of sort of Black people and people of color are involved in the political process so that they can make lasting change, isn't it?
It is. And, I agree with the mayor in terms of understanding that change is a long game. And so at the Black Futures Lab, a lot of what we focus on is making Black communities powerful in politics so that we can be powerful in the rest of our lives. And we do that by talking directly with our communities about what it is that we experience every single day in the economy, in our democracy, and in our society, and then what it is that we want to see done about it. What we did with that information is turned it into a legislative roadmap for how decision makers at every level can make Black Lives Matter from City Hall to Congress. And we're using that Black agenda as an organizing tool as we approach one of the most important election cycles in a generation. So again, it's so important for us to understand that change requires multiple levels of tools. It requires protest, but it also 100% requires policy change. And the glue between protest and policy change, quite frankly, is our communities and our imaginations for our future. And so that's what we're focused on and squarely embedded in right now.
Can I just share
Sunny,
just how much
go ahead, please.
Can I just say so how much I welcome that message, because it is about coming on all the different levels. One of the dangers we have at the moment, and I see, is a quite justifiable cynicism and pessimism coming in. That means people say, "Oh, I'm not doing politics. If I get involved in politics, I will become part of the system," and it leads us to abandon those opportunities, like becoming mayors or becoming members of parliament or going into the House, in which you might not get everything done that you wanted to get done, because it's a tough game. It's not easy. If it was easy, we just snap our fingers and get change. But we need to keep encouraging people to say, do you know what, even in the face of your potential failure, although you will have successes, you need to get in the game. You need to get on the field of play. So we have to be real about the scale of challenge, but really guard against that cynicism that actually leads people from our communities to step away from positions of influence.
Now, Sunny, does what will it take to make sure that we keep these sort of issues, these stories about the inequality of treatment of various parts of society? What will it take to make sure that those stay in the public's eye? I mean, often, this is a hot news story now. 6 months from now, maybe something else happens. I mean, what can we do to make sure that the real questions aren't basically ignored or pushed aside?
Yeah, I think that is a real challenge because there is fatigue, right? I certainly hear it often. All you talk about is race. There is more to it. There's a bigger story. But I think what people have to realize is that, unfortunately, at least in the United States, and perhaps the mayor can speak to it on a more global scale, race seems to infect every single other story. And so what I do, at least at ABC and in our newsroom, is I make sure that they understand that these stories, there's an intersectionality here. So if we're talking about the coronavirus, we're talking about COVID-19, well, that disproportionately affects Black and brown communities, and this is why. If we're talking about the presidential election, well, certain policies disproportionately affect the Black and brown community, and this is why. And so I think the way to make sure that these stories are ever present is to make sure that the majority understands that there is an intersection of race, at least in this country, with every single topic, because it affects not a majority, but almost a majority of Americans in our society. And I think that's the only way to do it.
Okay. So, Alicia, if you could do one thing, just make one change that you think would make sure that we have that sort of lasting value, that lasting public sort of sight of the disparity among Americans or among people around the world of various colors. And what would it be? I mean, is it political? Is it sort of social? Is it economic? If you could just do one change.
I would tell a news story about race and racism. So much of what we understand about racism is we think it's about people being mean to each other rather than a way of distributing power. And if we understood racism as a way of distributing power, we would understand why it was so important to keep talking about race. We would understand why it was so important to make Black Lives Matter. And that is true amongst all of the different systems of oppression, whether it be patriarchy or anything else. If we understood that it wasn't about good people or bad people, but a way of organizing and distributing power, I think it would help to unlock a lot of the challenges that we're facing today.
Now, Mayor Rees, I wanted to ask the same question. You could change one thing, and I know that obviously a lot needs to be changed, but what one thing do you think could actually make a difference and move the wheel?
If I talk about a specific policy, and then I'll talk about a broader, the specific policy in my city is affordable housing. Housing has been on the front end of hierarchy, as I really welcome that. Racism is about power and wealth. It's not about being nice to each other and so forth. So, and housing has been a tool of segregating people, robbing people of opportunity, and then home ownership and increasing price in home ownership has played itself out now in access to different schools. That's played itself out into issues of social mobility and educational opportunity. It's also a source of wealth. So for me, specific policy tool in the city is around housing. Broadly, I absolutely would build on that last point. We need to start talking about building wealth and wealth building. I say in my city, I'm a mixed race man. My mum is white, and some of my best friends are white. I got no issue with kind of integration and all that. But this is not about kumbaya, sitting around a campfire. Can we all like each other, listen to each other's music, and eat each other's food? This is about inequalities of wealth and power. And I think the real struggle on racism has to be reframed to be in terms of power. I see too many of these little Facebook videos come up of white children hugging black children, the mountaintop view. rather than dealing with those deep structural inequalities. And we urgently need that conversation around race to grow up very quickly.
Okay, Sunny, I'm throwing the same question at you. I know earlier you said, you raised a very important point about, what about the role of sort of Black prosecutors and people in that world? Are there other things that you think would make a real difference?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both Mayor Rees and Alicia that racism is really a way of distributing power, but also distributing wealth. I don't think that systemic change can happen without true equality of wealth. You have to somehow make changes in terms of this wealth gap that we see all around the world. In states, it's unbelievable that if you look at the data, it's going to take, I think, over 100 years for the average Black family to achieve what the average white family has today. That is unconscionable. And so if we can somehow figure out a way to mete out equality in terms of pay and opportunity, I think that will go a long way in terms of achieving that sort of distribution of power, because wealth really is power. I think when we talk about in corporations and we talk about in society, diversity, inclusion, and equity, companies seem to be okay or getting better at diversity. Companies seem to be okay and getting a little better at inclusion, sort of that mountaintop view that the mayor was talking about. But when you start talking about equity, when you start talking about people getting paid the same, when you start talking about people getting the same opportunities, companies have a problem with that. People seem to have a problem with that. They suddenly come up with all sorts of reasons why they deserve to make more money or they deserve that opportunity. And so I think there needs to be also a little more transparency in terms of the economic systems that are at play in corporations and just in every system around our country and around our world. And for far too long, as Black people, we have been dealing in the opaque when it comes to those structures. And I'd like to have a little more transparency when it comes to not only the acquisition of wealth, but really what those structures look like.
Now, Alicia, one of the things that in our world at Bloomberg, where we're very closely following the business world, we keep hearing this term of diversity fatigue and, oh boy, sort of a lot of people feel like they've gone through this and isn't it time to move on to something else? I'm curious, does that put, sort of the various sort of interests that, whether it's, people of color, whether it's women, whether it's people with disabilities, whatever, are they actually competing for sort of the face time and sort of attention of the broader population? And how can we stop that? I mean, is there a way for them to work together rather than at odds with one another?
Important question. And I will say I'm tired of talking about it too. I think a lot of us are. And it's not going to go away unless we address it. My mom used to say to me, sometimes the only way out is through. And I think that is what we're facing right now. The fact that so many people may feel like they're being forced to have this conversation over and over again is really because, we're not addressing the disparities that exist and that impact people's everyday lives. And so if you want to stop talking about it, then let's start changing some rules that have been rigged against our communities for a very, very long time. And frankly, I think the future of this moment, which certainly is 100% a movement, is actually that we are developing literacy and tools that are shifting our culture in dramatic ways. And sometimes that change is very fast, like what we've seen over the last 4 months. And sometimes that change is very slow, like what we've seen since 7 years of Black Lives Matter, or even, the precursor to Black Lives Matter, which was really kind of Hurricane Katrina, which really disrupted our idea that somehow the United States was past race, when we saw Black people abandoned on rooftops in the Gulf Coast. So the way out here is through. And the way that we get through this is by addressing the disparities that are impacting our communities and changing the rules that are allowing the status quo to remain intact. That's how I think we move through it.